The
If
family
one
tradition.
man could decide who entered
Nancy
America's living
Sinatra
rooms,
has
did he also have the right to shut the door?
have a
And if
fine
he saw
welcome
what
for a very
audiences
fine
never
talent.
saw, was silence
Is
still
the
a moral
camaraderie of
option?
show business.
Long before algorithms, Ed Sullivan was television's most powerful gatekeeper. Every Sunday night, The Ed Sullivan Show didn't just broadcast entertainment, it invited performers directly into millions of homes. A single nod from Sullivan could launch a career into the stratosphere, while a quiet refusal could end it just as quickly. Behind his stiff posture and awkward introductions was a man
I'm going to
obsessed
ask
with
her to sing
trust.
not only for
Sullivan
me,
believed he had an unspoken contract with American families. He wasn't only responsible for what was sung or danced on his stage, but for who was allowed to stand there at all. When the cameras stopped rolling, he watched closely how stars treated staff, how they handled power, how quickly charm turned into control. Years later, private conversations recalled by colleagues and personal notes discovered after his death revealed something unsettling. Sullivan had identified patterns of darkness long before scandals exploded in public. Tonight's story follows those private judgments and asks an uncomfortable question: how much should character matter when talent? The moment Elvis Presley stepped onto television screens in 1956, something in American culture shifted. Teenagers screamed.
Before I even had a chance to unwind.
Quite often over there.
Celebrity power was
Her
born.
father was in
His
behind.
appearances on the Ed Sullivan Show were not just
It wasn't like that.
They were
I went to
cultural
Paris and
events that redefined
on a
what
leave,
fame
and it was
could
all.
look like in the living room. Publicly, Sullivan framed his concerns as practical. For Elvis's final appearance, the cameras famously filmed him only from the waist up. Officially, it was about dancing deemed too provocative for a family audience. But staff members later recalled that Sullivan's unease went deeper than swiveling hips. He watched the crowds, especially the teenage girls, and sensed something that made him uncomfortable. When millions of young fans treated a grown man as an object of mere religious devotion, where did influence end and exploitation begin? Sullivan reportedly worried less about what Elvis did on stage and more about what that devotion enabled offstage. The power imbalance between a global idol and impressionable admirers was something television had never faced before. Unlike others on this list, Elvis had no criminal record and no public scandals during his Sullivan years. Yet later examinations of his private life complicated the picture. His relationship with Priscilla Presley began when she was just 14, long before they married. Priscilla would later describe a relationship shaped by control, image management, and emotional dependency. Did Sullivan know these details at the time? Almost certainly not. But he sensed a pattern: an adult star, surrounded by worshipful youth, protected by managers and softened by careful image control. Sullivan eventually praised Elvis on air, calling him a fine, decent boy, yet colleagues recalled lingering reservations behind the scenes. Elvis represents Sullivan's most controversial judgment. Not a villain, not a criminal, but a warning sign. If immense talent creates immense power, who is responsible for questioning how that power is used? And if this level of influence already unsettled Sullivan, what happened when the darkness was no longer subtle? On live television with millions watching, Jim Morrison made a choice that would define his relationship with America's most powerful television host. When the Doors appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1967, the band was riding a wave of psychedelic fame, and their hit, Light My Fire, was everywhere. Backstage, the rules were clear. Sullivan personally asked Morrison to change one lyric: "Girl, we couldn't get much higher," to avoid drug references on a family program. Morrison agreed. There was no argument, no protest. The understanding was simple: change the line or don't perform. Then the cameras rolled. Looking directly into the lens, Morrison sang the original lyric anyway. It wasn't a mistake, it was deliberate. In that instant, the performance stopped being about music and became a test of character. Was this artistic rebellion? Or something more calculated? A public breaking of trust for the sake of defiance?
If I was to say to you, return to wallow in the mire.
You will never do this show again. And they never did. Morrison was permanently banned. To Sullivan, this wasn't about censorship or conservative values. It was about a promise made and broken in front of the nation. If a performer was willing to look him in the eye, agree to a condition, and then undermine it live on air, what else would he disregard when consequences were less visible? Morrison's behavior only grew more erratic in the years that followed. Alcohol abuse escalated. Performances became unpredictable. The infamous Miami incident, where Morrison was arrested for allegedly exposing himself on stage, reinforced Sullivan's belief that this was not mere showmanship, but a deeper self-destructive impulse. Morrison died in Paris in 1971 at just 27. To many, he remains a poetic icon of rebellion. To Sullivan, he was something else entirely, proof that charisma and talent could coexist with a fundamental disregard for responsibility. And if breaking a single promise was enough to end a career on Sullivan's stage, what happened when power turned into control and control into violence? By the time James Brown stepped onto the Ed Sullivan Show, his legend was already forming in real time. On camera, he was pure electricity, sharp footwork, a band locked in like a machine, sweat flying as if the performance itself were a fight he intended to win. Ed Sullivan, famously restrained, still called him the hardest working man in show business. It sounded like admiration. It also sounded like a warning.
What are you gonna say?
Because backstage, Brown's discipline didn't end when the music stopped. He demanded absolute obedience. Musicians have described a system of fines for tiny mistakes, scuffed shoes, a missed cue, a step out of line rules enforced with humiliation and fear. When does perfectionism stop being professionalism and become domination? And if a crowd screams loud enough, who dares to tell the star he's gone too far? Sullivan reportedly kept a careful distance. He could not deny Brown's cultural force, but he didn't treat him like the harmless guest you invite into a family living room. Stories followed Brown wherever he went. A volatile temper, explosive rages, and an appetite for control that reached beyond the stage. Over the years, those stories hardened into police reports, arrests, and accusations involving domestic violence, weapons, and drugs. None of it erased the brilliance of his music, but it did darken the... Brown's private relationships became the darkest evidence. Multiple partners accused him of brutal beatings. His third wife, Adrienne Rodriguez, filed for divorce and assault more than once, then returned a cycle that left outsiders wondering what leverage, love, fear, dependency kept the door from closing. How many times can a pattern repeat before it stops being complicated and becomes predictable? And when the people closest to a genius are scared of him, what does that genius really cost? Sullivan faced a dilemma that still feels modern. Brown's art was foundational. His rhythms would shape funk, soul, disco, and later hip-hop through endless sampling. Cutting him off entirely meant denying audiences a transformative force. Yet, embracing him fully meant lending moral cover to behavior Sullivan found disturbing. So the relationship stayed transactional, applause on air, distance off it. And the longer Brown's record grew, the more that distance looked less like prudishness and more like instinct in hindsight. The first thing Ed Sullivan noticed was not the music. It was the way Ike Turner watched his wife. As Tina Turner stepped onto the stage of the Ed Sullivan Show, radiant and explosive, Ike's eyes followed her every move, not with pride but with control. To most viewers, Ike and Tina Turner were one of the most thrilling live acts in America. To Sullivan, something about the dynamic felt wrong. On stage, the chemistry was undeniable.
Yes, Wednesday.
Their performances, especially songs like Proud Mary, were tightly choreographed storms of sound and movement. Tina commanded attention. Ike directed from the shadows, but backstage staff members recalled a tension that never fully relaxed. Sullivan was not easily fooled by polish. He paid attention to tone, posture, silence, and what he saw unsettled him. How much violence can hide behind a perfect routine? And when one performer shines brighter than the other, who really holds the power when the curtain falls? According to people who worked the show, Sullivan developed a noticeably warmer rapport with Tina while keeping Ike at a professional distance. This was unusual. Ike was known for demanding recognition and control over every aspect of the act. Yet Sullivan often praised Tina directly, sometimes pointedly, as if acknowledging her presence apart from her husband. It was a subtle deviation, but in the world of television etiquette it spoke volumes. Years later, Tina would confirm what Sullivan had only sensed. In her autobiography and subsequent interviews, she described years of severe physical abuse, beatings, intimidation, and being forced to perform while injured. Cocaine-fueled rages were common. Escape felt impossible. The control Sullivan glimpsed backstage was real, and it was constant. In 1976, Tina finally fled the marriage with little more than a credit card and her money. Only then did the full scale of the abuse become public. Looking back, Sullivan's discomfort seemed less like moral judgment and more like early recognition. Ike Turner's musical contributions remain significant. Many historians credit his early recordings as foundational to rock and rhythm and blues. But Sullivan understood something crucial before most audiences did. Greatness on stage does not cancel cruelty off it. And if violence could be hidden for years behind synchronized steps and applause, what happened when control crossed into outright predation? For a time, Chuck Berry seemed untouchable. His guitar riffs rewrote popular music, his lyrics captured teenage life with wit and urgency, and his influence reached everyone from the Beatles to the Rolling Stones. When Berry appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, audiences saw a smiling architect of rock and roll, confident, clever, and in complete command. What they didn't see was the file quietly growing behind the scenes. Sullivan reportedly booked Berry once and never wanted to do it again. Not because of the performance it was flawless, but because of what surfaced afterward. Berry's legal troubles predated his fame, including a conviction for armed robbery in the 1,940 seconds. More troubling was his 1,959 arrest and conviction under the Mann Act for transporting a 14-year-old girl across state lines. For Sullivan, crimes involving minors crossed a moral line that talent could not erase. How much innovation is enough to outweigh exploitation, and who decides when admiration becomes complicity? Berry's career survived prison, but the pattern did not end there. Decades later, in 1990, a new scandal revealed a darker form of control. Berry was sued in a class action case after women discovered hidden cameras installed in the bathroom of a restaurant he owned. The act was not impulsive or accidental, it was systematic. For Sullivan, had he lived to see it, this would not have been rock and roll excess. It was predatory behavior, an abuse of power in its most invasive form. Berry settled the lawsuit for a reported seven-figure sum, but the damage was irreversible. The contrast between his joyous music and the violation described in court filings forced a painful reckoning. Could the same mind that wrote Johnny B. Good also normalize the surveillance of unsuspecting women? And if so, what does that say about how easily genius can mask harm? Sullivan's discomfort with Berry now reads as prescient rather than prudish. He was willing to forgive arrogance, even temper. He was not willing to excuse exploitation. Berry's case crystallized a rule Sullivan seemed to live by: some lines once crossed could not be negotiated back. And if crossing that line meant the end of trust, what happened when danger no longer hid behind charm but announced itself openly? When Jerry Lee Lewis first exploded onto television, he looked like the future. He attacked the piano as if it owed him money, kicked the bench aside, and played with a ferocity that made older performers seem tame overnight. On the Ed Sullivan Show, Lewis embodied everything thrilling and terrifying about early rock and roll. Sullivan had taken a chance on him. It would be the last time. The collapse came fast. In 1958, during a British tour, reporters uncovered a truth Lewis had tried to hide. The 22-year-old star had married his 13-year-old cousin. Lewis attempted damage control, lying about her age, and treating the revelation like a misunderstanding. Sullivan didn't see it that way. To him, this wasn't youthful recklessness or bad judgment. It was a fundamental moral breach. How far could talent stretch before it snapped trust completely? And when a performer endangers the very audience a family show is meant to protect, is there any room left for forgiveness? Sullivan's response was absolute. Lewis was quietly but permanently cut off. No second booking, no redemption arc. Within weeks, radio stations dropped his records, concerts were canceled. His performance fee reportedly fell from tens of thousands of dollars a night to a few hundred. The fall wasn't symbolic, it was measurable, brutal, and immediate. What makes Sullivan's reaction unsettling in hindsight is what followed. Lewis's personal life unraveled into a pattern of violence and chaos. Multiple marriages ended amid allegations of physical abuse. 2 wives died young under circumstances that fueled years of speculation. Substance abuse and rage became inseparable from his public image. The man nicknamed the Killer began to look less like a showman and more like a villain. Did Sullivan sense this trajectory, or did he simply refuse to gamble with it? Either way, his decision stands out as one of the clearest moral lines he ever drew. Unlike cases where he hesitated or compromised, Lewis triggered a full stop. Jerry Lee Lewis would later rebuild a career in country music, even earning late-life acclaim. But he never returned to Sullivan's stage. The door closed once, and it stayed closed. And if one scandal was enough to end everything, what happened when danger didn't explode publicly, but simmered, quietly ignored, and armed? Ed Sullivan never needed a scandal to make up his mind about Bill Spector. Long before the headlines, before the trials, before the word murder entered the conversation, Sullivan reportedly warned his staff to keep Spector away. There was something about him, something that felt unstable, dangerous, and far beyond ordinary show business arrogance. Spector's influence was undeniable. His wall of sound transformed pop music, turning simple songs into dense emotional monuments. Records he produced dominated the charts and shaped an era. Yet Sullivan refused to elevate him personally. Acts associated with Spector appeared, but the producer himself was deliberately kept off the stage. To Sullivan, this wasn't jealousy, it was instinct. What does it mean when a gatekeeper senses danger before anyone can point to a single crime? Behind the studio glass, Spector's behavior grew increasingly alarming. He exerted extreme control over artists, particularly women. Ronnie Spector, lead singer of the Ronettes, and later his wife, would eventually describe being kept virtually imprisoned in their mansion, isolated, monitored, and threatened if she tried to leave. Power wasn't just creative, it was coercive. Stories circulated quietly through the industry, Spector bringing guns into recording sessions, placing them on the piano, pointing them at artists to intimidate or motivate. Musicians like John Lennon and Leonard Cohen later confirmed encounters that felt less like collaboration and more like survival. How many warnings can be ignored before fear becomes normalized? Sullivan, according to those who worked with him, wanted no part of it. He believed Spector's brilliance masked something fundamentally broken. In an era that often excused volatility as genius, Sullivan made an uncommon choice: he withheld legitimacy. He did not confront Spector publicly. He simply refused to help him grow larger. Decades later, the intuition seemed chillingly precise. In 2003, actress Lana Clarkson was found dead in Spector's mansion from a gunshot wound. After years of trials, Spector was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to prison, where he would eventually die. Spector's case stands as the most extreme confirmation of Sullivan's private judgments. The darkness Sullivan sensed was not metaphorical. It was armed, escalating, and lethal. And if one man could see that future coming and chose distance instead of silence, what responsibility did that awareness carry?
Show opens right now with the exciting
darkness eventually reached the headlines. There were others who lived inside that darkness long before the public ever noticed. They were not supporting characters in someone else's myth. They were witnesses, and in many cases survivors. Women like Tina Turner, Ronnie Spector, and Priscilla Presley represent a different kind of legacy, not power exercised, but power endured. Ed Sullivan could not always intervene directly. What he could do, staff later suggested, was signal recognition. With Tina Turner, that recognition was visible. While Ike commanded control behind the scenes, Sullivan made a point of addressing Tina herself, warmly, publicly, and sometimes pointedly, as if separating her from the man beside her. In the rigid etiquette of network television, that choice mattered. It suggested Sullivan saw more than choreography. He saw imbalance. But recognition is not rescue. For years, Tina remained trapped in a cycle of violence and fear, performing through injuries, keeping a flawless public image, while her private life collapsed. When she finally fled in 1976, leaving behind money and status, her story reframed decades of whispers. What once sounded like intuition became undeniable truth. Sullivan's unease no longer seemed subjective. It looked accurate. Ronnie Spector's account carried a similar weight. Married to Phil Spector, she later described a life defined by isolation and control, luxury without freedom, creativity without autonomy. She wrote of being monitored, threatened, and frightened into compliance while the world celebrated records made inside that pressure cooker. The music audiences adored was created alongside terror they never saw. Her testimony forced a painful rereading of the genius narrative that had protected him. Priscilla Presley's reflections added another layer. There were no police reports, no courtroom verdicts. Instead, she spoke of subtler domination, of being shaped, directed, and emotionally contained from adolescence. Her words complicate Elvis's image without flattening it into caricature. They underline a quieter truth. Harm does not always arrive as a punch. Sometimes it arrives as a rule, a look, a boundary that keeps shrinking. These survivors turn moral argument into human consequence. They remind us that behind every scandal delayed, there are years of silence paid for by someone else. Sullivan could deny access to a stage and withhold legitimacy, but he could not dismantle the structures that protected powerful men. And that leaves the uncomfortable question: if these voices had been heard sooner and believed, how many legends would we remember differently today? Ed Sullivan never called himself a moral judge, yet for nearly 2 decades his decisions shaped American culture. With only a few television channels appearing on his stage meant entering millions of homes, Sullivan believed that privilege carried responsibility. He saw his role as a contract of trust with families who invited strangers into their living rooms every Sunday night. Looking back, his private doubts about certain legends feel imperfect but revealing. He was not reacting to rebellion, youth culture, or musical innovation. Again and again, his concerns centered on patterns of behavior control, exploitation, broken promises, and violence hidden behind charisma. Long before scandals surfaced publicly, Sullivan sensed when talent was being used as a shield rather than a gift. That gatekeeper world no longer exists. Today, algorithms reward attention, outrage, and virality, often without asking who is harmed along the way. Platforms amplify brilliance and misconduct at the same speed, leaving judgment scattered and delayed. So the question remains painfully current. How much should character matter when art changes history? At what point does celebrating talent become complicity? And who, if anyone, should draw the line? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below today.